So when Trump visited Montoursville in May of last year, he was beginning to ramp up that move towards the campaign that's going to end now in 14 days. He gathered people on the regional airport in Williamsport on the tarmac to watch people cheer him on as he worked the crowd with stories that we've seen before, heard before from Trump. He talked about economic devastation. He talked about the role of poor governance in creating trade deals that he said had ruined the region and had really caused a lot of economic problems for people. He also talked about the need to move forward by looking towards the past. It's kind of a contradiction of resilience that you might need Doc Brown to kind of help untangle. But even though we can't get back to the future, these contradictions of past, present, future, and the questions of governance and the role of creating a new possible economic future created a spectacle for Trump that simultaneously posed him as a mutual victim of incompetent governance, a victimhood that he shared with many of his audience members, and witch hunts that were perpetuated by people who hate him, that hate his audience, and crafted himself as a strong man that has made America great again. These spectacles lie at the heart of his ethos as president, and this is the object of study in this particular research project. My name's Timothy Betts, and the project that I'm presenting for you today is called Examining Economic Reality and Media Spectacle at Trump Campaign Rallies. I'm a doctoral student in the University of South Florida's Department of Communication, and I study organizational communication. But I use those lenses as a way to understand how we organize this concept of economic reality. And this project explores how Trump campaign rallies manifest a spectacle that shapes how individuals make sense of the economy around them. In other words, the study explores kind of the contradictions that lie at the heart of Trump's trends towards and calls towards a new normal, which almost embody a sense of resilience, and how those contradictions are resolved in the performance that he plays. And we talked a lot about the kind of performance and the role of the audience in the previous paper, and I want to bring that more to light in these questions today. So let's delve in with kind of the first thing that I use to frame this examination, which is the notion of economic reality and its construction. When you think of markets, you might think of this farmer's market right here, or perhaps the stock market where you've got traders rushing around and being hectic. Or maybe you just think of the numbers, the gross domestic product, the consumer price index, the unemployment rate. These are ways that we've traditionally thought about market systems and thought about the economy. And those numbers that economists have assigned help us to understand really how the economy is faring. But I don't think they tell the whole story. And I think that that is at the heart of this question of economic reality. Economists have conceived of these numbers to help us understand how the economy is working, but the numbers themselves are often encased in political rhetoric, discourse, and negotiation. The reality of economics is not in the numbers or in the statistics that we assign to them. They exist in the human behavior. They exist as communication. Now, many economists think of the role of communication in the question of economic reality as kind of a container metaphor. Organizational communication scholars have long used this question of a container metaphor to analyze how we understand the role of communication in organizing systems. And the container metaphor basically says we think of communication as a thing that happens inside of the economy. But I want to challenge us all to think about the economy differently as we look towards Trump campaign rallies. Instead of as a container, I want you to think of the economy as a story. What I argue for is a radical reinterpretation of the question of economy. It's a story that we tell ourselves to make sense of the world around us, the choices that we make, the products that we buy, and in narrating a story, making a story out of the question of economy, we embed logics and problematic assumptions and certain ideas that create that foundation upon which we base our lives and our economic decisions. In other words, the economy is not just out there for economists to study. It's not a thing that you can knock on or smell or observe in the kind of way that economists would like to portray the physics of economics. Instead, the numbers themselves, the ideas that we've come up with, are embedded in stories. And for Trump, and he's not alone in this, the numbers that we typically use to understand economic reality can represent anything as they become mere plot points in the stories that we tell of how America's doing, how people are faring, and what challenges we face, and most importantly, what we do in response to those challenges. The next idea that I want to build upon in this examination of Trump campaign rallies is the concept of media spectacle. And Guy Debord really established this idea in 1967 with the Society of the Spectacle, and he describes two specific ways that spectacle shapes and controls people. The first is this concept of concentration. We're going to use the prism as an example here. The concentrated spectacle takes an ideology and concentrates lived experience into a single monolithic idea of what reality is. He specifically wrote that ideology condensed around a dictatorial personality creates spectacle of concentration to create this idea of what is fundamentally real, a singular idea. But spectacle also is diffuse. It fragments and creates this abundance of possibility out of a single possible concept. And so spectacle operates in two ways. It both concentrates and fragments. We've talked a lot about the concept of performance. We've talked about stage. I love Broadway. It's fine. And I think that we can use the metaphor of the stage to really engage with both of these ideas of the economy as a story and the notion of logic as a mechanism of control. We can think of the economy as the performance that's going on stage, whether it's a play, whether it's a symphony. It is the performance that is enacted in front of us. And the spectacle is the theater itself. And this is built off of the work of David Bogie, who talks about the notion of spectacle as a constitutive logic for organizing, where spectacle shapes the performance in those ways. But maybe we need to expand that view. Maybe we need to expand it to include the audience, because as it comes to the concept of economic reality and the questions of what is fundamentally economically real, we have to include the spectators and really question whether or not there are actually spectators at all. Because aren't we all engaged in the process of constructing this economic reality to which we are all subject? In this way, the concept of mega spectacle shapes how we as spectators are invited onto the stage, into the frame, perhaps as on a Trump rally, where literally individuals are not only the backdrop of Trump's campaign performance, but also how they actually step into the frame, interact, as we talked about, with the president, and shape his understanding of economic reality, shape the actual performance that's going on around him. People are co-constructing this narrative on Trump campaign rallies, performances, and that is what's really interesting about them. We talked about how Trump engages with the audience and becomes part of them. Let's think instead about the audience becoming a part of the performance to manifest a new great normal. The final idea that I build upon in this paper is the question of communicative resilience, which is originally theorized by Busnell in 2010. Patrice Busnell talks about this question of constructing new normals in the face of disruption. Now, most of resilience literature talks about this as an individual level disruption, thinking about how people face the possibility of death or how individuals cope with disaster, things along those lines. But I want to take a macro discursive understanding of resilience, looking at resilience as a larger negotiation that occurs on the political stage. And the question of resilience is really interesting because it's often thought of as a positive question, as one that propels us to new and greater things. But in many ways, Trump campaign rallies show us a negative or critical aspect of resilience, and how in the process of imploding or creating a vision of a new normal, we may actually embed problematic assumptions into the foundation of that new normal that we are envisioning. So for the purpose of this paper, I look at three separate rallies that occur in the Rust Belt, much like Professor Frank. We talk about three separate rallies that occur, and for this paper, it's over the course of 3 years. First, I talk about a rally in Youngstown, Ohio that occurred in 2017, right after the president was inaugurated. Then we move a little bit to the east, where we have in 2018 a rally in Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, which is actually over, just a couple of miles away from Joe Biden's birthplace in Scranton. And finally, in 2019, I look at, we take a 1.5 hour drive west to Montoursville, which is again in the Rust Belt. And this is right at the beginning, it's May 2019, of the campaign towards 2020, the election that's going to happen in just a few weeks, or is actually happening right now. All three of these communities face really similar struggles of deindustrialization that we talked about before, where the loss of manufacturing jobs, the trade deals have all impacted for many people not only their own economic security, but exacerbated these tendencies towards economic inequality and other aspects of their situation that have been so negative, and that we talked about that Trump capitalizes upon already. And these three rallies I chose because they actually talked about the economy most clearly, and they were identified by the C-SPAN archives as such. But they also represent a really interesting kind of perspective across the 3 years of the administration. And they show how Trump's campaign rallies built up the ethos of a candidate and how that translates into the administration itself. To analyze these ideas, I build on deconstruction, posed by Derrida and of grammatology, and basically the idea that unstable language is guided in its interpretation. We are guided in our interpretation of language in many ways, and one of the ways that this occurs is through the construction of binary logics. And so I wanted to examine binary logics that occur within these Trump rallies, and moreover, look at where these logics break down. Where do they fail, and where is there incoherence that's created in them? And so betrayal and revival is an example that I offer here. It's also the first example that I want to explore in the Trump campaign rallies. Now, deindustrialization was a massive problem for the Rust Belt. People lost jobs. And for Trump, it wasn't just a natural process. A lot of people talk about the Obama quotation that these manufacturing jobs aren't going to come back. And for a lot of people and economists, we think of manufacturing jobs as the simple attrition of a country moving towards a different kind of economy. But Trump portrays them as an act of betrayal. Let's listen.
They really were the backbone of our country, the backbone of American strength and might. But the loyalty of our workers was repaid with betrayal. You were betrayed by our politicians. You were betrayed by the people that ran our country, but you're not betrayed anymore.
The dynamic of betrayal and revival that emerges in these campaign rallies is really fascinating to me, because it creates a separation between Trump's supporters as loyal American patriots and the other people, the Democrat, the evil that is trying to destroy or further erode individuals' economic situation. There's an example of a border discussion that happens in the Youngstown, Ohio rally, where Trump likens the defending of the American border to the defending of the American way and the defending of American jobs. These construct the concept of disruption upon which Trump builds this appeal towards resilience. He says, you were betrayed by the people that ran our country, but he offers revival in his own personal candidacy and administration. But the interesting thing about this is that he creates kind of a bind for himself, because the promise of revival leaves little room for the sense of betrayal that was so central to his candidacy in 2016. He built up himself as the voice of the ignored majority, the silent majority, this economic anxiety and aggrievedness that propelled his campaign in the Rust Belt. But this makes it really difficult for him because as he discusses in the Montoursville rally, are we keeping America great, or are we making America great again? That question of time and temporality is really important to the question of disruption. And he asked the audience. I mean, he polled just as though he were at a concert or a football game. And he's asking the audience whether or not he should keep the slogan, Make America Great Again, or move towards a new Keep America Great. Now, Trump was surprised by the response. And let's take a look.
Make America great again. Whoa! Wow. Well, I like it because we'll sell many, many more hats that way.
At least Trump is keeping his eye on what's most important: merchandising, merchandising, merchandising. But the question of whether or not to change the slogan and the actual tepid response to the slogan, the old slogan, "Make America Great Again," is really fascinating, because the audience is no longer responding as well to that notion of betrayal. And so the binary logic starts to erode. The second idea that I want to explore is the question of folly and strength. Now, Trump builds his campaign on the question of personal strength, but in some certain circumstances, he softens his tone on his opponents. Another binary emerges in this case, where it's not just an active betrayal. Sometimes the politicians are just stupid, according to Trump. Let's hear.
The politicians just watched as other countries stole our jobs, plundered our wealth, and looted the crown jewels of the American economy. But I am not another politician. I keep my promises to the people. I didn't need this. I didn't need this. I didn't need it. I had a very nice life.
The image of Trump as a billionaire, as someone who is both wealthy and successful and also didn't need the presidency, is part of this question of strength. And it rejects this notion of folly. He can administer the government. And he also later says in this rally, "I ran and we saved America." It's his own personal strength, in contradiction of the previous American stupidity, that allowed other countries to, as he said, steal the crown jewels of the American economy. The other question that we have going on is one that's embodied in this really fascinating clip, where Trump likens himself to some of the most important figures in American history: Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and Roosevelt. Let's hear what he has to say about Mount Rushmore.
Every single president on Mount Rushmore. Now, here's what I do. I'd ask whether or not you think I will someday be on Mount Rushmore, but no.
He says he can't ask whether or not he would be on Mount Rushmore, because the fake news media would say that he believes he should be on Mount Rushmore, which is the intended idea, right? He's saying that the people who are on Mount Rushmore, and later in this clip expands upon the fact that they wanted protectionist policies to protect American industry. But that question of personal strength is really important, because he's linking himself not only to figures that have written their histories, their own personal image on the history of America, but he's also linking his own identity to that of national pride that we have in Mount Rushmore, in the history of American greatness that he's building upon in this legacy that he tries to cement himself into. And it positions economic resilience as a battle against enemies both on the inside and the outside. This question of folly makes it not just that his political opponents are stupid; they're being tricked over. They're being run over by enemies on the outside of the country. And in doing so, this persona of strength allows Trump to take on the actual spectacle of resilience. Finally, we have destruction and transcendence, constructing a sense of resilience out of an opposition to the destruction of the American way. Now, this is a really important idea that came out of these three rallies, was the notion of destruction. In almost all of the cases that Trump described his political opponents, he talked about Democratic politicians' policies, and then immediately contrasted them with images of terrorism, images of destruction, images of criminals coming across the border. This is a tool that he's used often.
You have some.
But as we move towards another clip where Trump is talking about the enemies that he faces in his campaigns, we see how he relates to his political opponents and relates his audience to them.
Who the hell knew it was going to be this difficult, but I love it. You know why I love it? Even though we had artificial obstacles put in our path, even though we had phony Russian hoaxes and witch hunts and people that hate Trump and hate you, angry Democrats, all after us with all of it, and they still have it's like little embers that are burning. They're going crazy.
He positions the people who are his political opponents as people who hate not only him, but the American way of life embodied by those who attend his rallies and are his audience. In that way, absolving himself, inviting people onto the stage to be part of the political manifestation of his own victimhood that he talks about. The paper also goes on to discuss the question of spectacle and economics and how these logics embedded in these narratives shape the way that we make sense of economic reality around us, and how they also become a spectacle of resilience, how this question of macro-discursive resilience is shaped around problematic ideas of governance and problematic ideas about the relationship between people, political opposition, discourse, and Trump's concept of economic reality to begin with. I'm so excited to hear your questions and to hear from the discussant on this panel. This has been a really exciting paper to do. And I leave you with the words of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because I think this is an interesting and important idea that we can bring to this discussion. Even as these concepts of economic reality are storied in a certain way, we can organize economies in different ways. AOC has talked about how we can organize government to the ends of our people, the way or the ends that we want. And I think that that concept of restoring, that's central to the question of socially constructed economic reality, is a hopeful one that we can bring into our future analyses and future questions of what we want our economy to look like. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Timothy. Very interesting presentation. So let's turn back to Steve Lano, who's going to give us some thoughts on this paper.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. And thank you, Timothy, for your presentation. That was fantastic. I'm also a big Broadway fan, but I live a little bit closer out here in Queens, so I get to go a little bit more, but no one's going until the summer now, apparently. And we'll see.
Yeah, I envy you in that sense, the closeness.
Survives after all this is, the state is giving them no money and there's no federal money. So there's going to be a lot of theaters that will go under, but we'll see what survives. But in terms of the paper, this is another paper, just like Frank's paper, that is ambitious. It purports not only, I thought David had it bad trying to say, here's how these rallies work, but Betts decides to explain also how the economy works. So, good luck. But actually, it's a really, really, really good way of thinking about it. So the way that the argument is set up in the paper, and I really look forward to reading it in publication, is that economics is constructed through we can rely on two primary theories to understand how economics operates. The first is Debord's spectacle theory, and the next is economic narrative. And so instead of, I think what you say in the paper is that people construct their economic realities, and there's some level of kind of materiality there, but you can go much further than that and just say economics itself is a discursive organization. And therefore, the way I read it in the paper, therefore, if economics is a discursive organization, it too always has to craft and reiterate its resilience in the face of alternative narratives that say, it no longer exists this way. For example, the discussion around Thomas Piketty's book 2 years ago is a good example of that kind of what that looks like in public address when these economic spectacle. I like the prism example of that, for the spectacle of coming together and then a single point coming apart is a really nice way of thinking about it. And I think what you said in the presentation should be the way the paper articulates it. I think that the presentation was really spot on in that. And I would encourage you to look at that as the kind of the way to structure that opening framework for the argument. One of the things about Betts' paper that I think is most interesting is how much work he does, and it's in the presentation, you'll saw this too, how much work he does using the C-SPAN archive to identify what he calls these deconstructive binary oppositions after Derrida, these essential contradictions that ironically hold together the entire Trump narrative. I want to quote Betts from his paper to show you how funny this turns out to be. So this is Betts writing. He says, Trump's campaign was dependent on credibly responding to economic disparities for those he claimed to have been forgotten, and on deriving authority from righteous indignation at a system that has forgotten people. So this is a very complex rhetorical move that it takes a little bit of work to identify as a contradiction. He's saying that everyone has ignored this, but I helped it, and it was ignored from the highest levels of government systematically, but now I've helped it by mentioning that it was ignored. It's this wonderful kind of delicious irony there. And these examples are great. And Betts relies on Derrida for this, but Derrida is like maybe like kind of some massive equipment here. Like Derrida purports to, I mean, he's got a very healthy ego. He purports to explain that this is how all language functions, is through essential contradiction, all of it. So deconstruction is the art of taking any text and finding these contradictions. Now, not to show how much I watch C-SPAN archive videos or how much I pay attention to political rhetoric, but this is a sledgehammer when we need a scalpel. I think that's John McCain or Barack Obama. I can't remember who first said that, but when we look to other tools to make the same argument where you could even get more out of the conversation, I think immediately of Chaim Perlman and Lucy Ulbricht-Titica's work, and I know that David will chime in on this as well, in their book, The New Rhetoric, on appearance-reality pairing. So what it looks like in appearance-reality pairing is the rhetor, the speaker, says, here's what it looks like it's going on, but in reality, we all know it is this other thing. And they have a whole section of the book where they talk about how this rhetoric operates in argumentation. And I think if you reiterated the paper for publication using that, you would be able to make some really nice, fine parsing to make these contradictions really shine in a way that I don't think deconstruction theory allows you to make these shine in the way that your analysis has them work really well in the paper, because they're really fantastic. They're well grounded and you do a good job of explaining them. But deconstruction doesn't really, I mean, it's like, well, all language works this way. So what's so special about the Trump rally and what Trump is doing? What's the payoff about his particular rhetorical intervention here? And I think if you use appearance reality pairing after Perlman and Ulbricht-Titica's work, that would be great. Also, I think that there's interesting tension here between economic articulation and economic indicators. And Frank's paper talks about this in great detail too. But I think that's something that I don't know if it's in this paper, but maybe for future work, is to think about the tension between when economic indicators appear, how do those threaten the resilience of economic realities or economic articulation? I wouldn't use the word realities at all here, but I'm more of a rhetorician than an org-com person. My last suggestion is to focus more of the paper on this term resilience and make resilience more of the star here. That's such an interesting concept. I'm not an organizational communication person, but that really got me interested in tropes and figures and schemata of resilience. And I think making that sort of the thread is like, how does Trump create resilience? Let us count the ways kind of paper would be really good. Even though it is exciting to talk about economic narrative and all that kind of stuff. So I'll leave the audience here with a couple of questions about Betts' paper that we can discuss. First of all, is resilience and is organizational communication theory far too logocentric for its own good? By that, I mean, do they depend on the words more than the feelings, right? And this is what we call the affective turn in contemporary humanities, kind of sweeping across it, just like race, class, and gender did in the 80s. Now we have affect instead of effect, effective reasoning. So questions for Betts' paper is the time of day, the choice of city, the choice of geography. That came out a lot in the paper in terms of they have an resilient economic narrative, but do these constrain or give rhetorical opportunity for Trump to craft innovative, resilient narratives that wouldn't appear in other places? Now that would be a big payoff for this research in that way. But I think all of us could think about how logocentric is our research in dealing with politics, and is that a liability? Secondly, what is the nature and function of spectacle in the rally itself, away from the economic function of spectacle? Might be something worth thinking about. Is spectacle a robust enough theory to account for what's happening at these rallies? Because I do like the idea of many people coming together and sort of forming Donald Trump as some kind of weird avatar, and then he spreads himself back out in the crowd as some kind of strange kind of astral projection, rhetorical astral projection, which is the kind of the image I got here. And then what are the rhetorical aspects of economics? And there's a couple of thinkers come to mind who weren't in the paper but are worth looking at. Deidre McCloskey's work on the rhetoric of economics, I'm sure you're familiar with, but also Richard Thaler is a behavioral economist who famously wrote about how economists don't study people, they study econs, little imaginary perfect people who always buy low and sell high and are never influenced by bad commercials or anything like that. And a lot of the narrative stuff you're drawing on reminded me of Thaler's work, which might be, I'm not an economist, so it might be dated or it might be out of vogue now, but Thaler and McCloskey could provide some depth in a discussion of narrative economics that would complement the organizational comm and the communication scholars' work on economics. But great paper. I'm looking forward to reading the published version. My final thought is try to get the narrative more around resilience as kind of the star, and then show how resilience is theorized and how Trump breaks with that and does kind of this unique thing. And I think you've got a really great contribution to the research, not just on Trump, but also on organizational communication and practice. So thank you.